I've always liked the idea of being far away from people. No traffic. No noise. No neighbors arguing through thin walls. Just trees, wind, and the kind of quiet that feels like it's cleaning out your head. But after hearing these stories, I realized something. When you go off-grid, you don't just leave the world behind. You also leave behind help. Witnesses. Streetlights. Cameras. Cell service. And sometimes, you don't get to choose who your neighbors are. Here are 4 very scary, supposedly true stories about off-grid neighbors. I moved off-grid because I wanted peace. That's what I told everyone anyway. The truth was uglier. I was broke, burned out, and tired of being surrounded by people who always wanted something. My uncle had passed and left me a small cabin in a wooded area that wasn't exactly deep wilderness, but it was far enough that you couldn't see another house from the road. The cabin wasn't fancy. It had old wood walls, a little propane stove, and a well that worked if you didn't run it too long. No internet. Spotty cell service if you stood on the porch and held your phone up like you were trying to catch lightning. But the first night there, I slept better than I had in months. The second morning, I stepped outside and noticed smoke. Thin, gray smoke, rising up through the trees in the distance. I remember thinking, okay. So I do have a neighbor. That didn't bother me. If anything, it was a relief. There was someone else out here. Someone who could, at least in theory, hear me if I got hurt or needed help. The smoke was far off, but it didn't drift. It didn't spread. It went straight up like it was being poured from a single point. It was weirdly steady, like the fire never changed. I watched it for a minute, then went back inside to make coffee. That night I saw it again. Same smoke. Same spot. And the next day, same. After 4 days, it started bothering me. Not because it was there, but because it was always exactly the same. The same thin gray line. The same amount. The same height. Like someone was burning something every day at the same time, with the same fuel, in the same way. On the 5th day, I decided to walk toward it. I told myself I was just being friendly. Just introducing myself. Maybe trading numbers in case of emergencies. I packed a small bag, brought water, and followed a deer trail that led deeper into the trees. The farther I went, the quieter it got. Not peaceful quiet, more like the woods were holding their breath. After about 40 minutes, I realized the smoke looked closer, but also somehow not. Like no matter how much I walked, the distance never changed. Still, I kept going. Then I heard something. A slow, rhythmic sound. Like someone tapping wood. Tap, tap, tap. I stopped and listened. It wasn't a bird. It was too steady. Too deliberate. I started moving again, slower now, and the tapping stopped. That should have been my sign to turn around. But I didn't. When I finally reached the spot where the smoke should have been, there was no fire. No campsite. No cabin. No chimney. Just a small clearing with blackened earth, like a fire had been there, but not recently. There were old ashes crusted into the ground, and a ring of stones that looked like it hadn't been touched in years. And right in the center of it was a metal pole. It was planted straight into the ground like a marker. And attached to it was something that made my stomach drop. A wind chime. But it wasn't made of metal tubes. It was made of bones. Small bones at first, maybe deer or rabbit. then larger ones. Some of them were too long and too straight to be animal. They clicked together softly when the wind moved them, making a dry, hollow sound that felt wrong in the middle of the day. I stood there staring, trying to make sense of it. Then I noticed the smell. Not smoke. Rot. Like something dead, somewhere nearby. I took a step back, and my boot hit something half buried in the dirt. I looked down. It was a piece of cloth. Faded blue. Like denim. I crouched and pulled at it carefully, and it came free with a sticky tearing sound. Under it was hair. Human hair, matted and dark, stuck to something that didn't want to let go. I froze. I didn't dig further. I didn't even think. I just stood up and backed away like the ground was going to grab my ankles. That's when I heard the tapping again. But it wasn't coming from the woods. It was behind me. I turned. At the edge of the clearing, between two trees, someone was standing perfectly still. At first, my brain refused to understand what I was seeing. They were dressed in dark clothes, maybe a jacket, but it blended into the shadows. Their face looked covered. Like a cloth mask or something pulled up. They weren't holding anything. They weren't moving. They were just watching me. I tried to speak. Something stupid like, "Hey, I'm sorry," but my throat tightened and all that came out was air. The person tilted their head slowly, like they were listening to a sound only they could hear. Then they raised one hand. And pointed. Not at me. Past me. Toward the direction of my cabin. My heart started beating so hard I could feel it in my teeth. I turned and ran. I didn't run like a calm adult. I ran like a kid running from a nightmare. I crashed through branches, slid on wet leaves, and didn't stop even when my lungs burned. I kept expecting footsteps behind me. I kept expecting a hand on my shoulder. But all I heard was the woods, and that dry clicking sound, like bones knocking together. When I reached my cabin, I slammed the door and locked it, even though the lock was basically a joke. I grabbed the only weapon I had, an old hatchet I used for splitting kindling, and stood there shaking, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No knocking. Just silence. I spent the rest of the day with every curtain closed. When the sun went down, I didn't turn on lights. I sat in the dark, gripping the hatchet, listening for any sound that wasn't the wind. At around 2:13 a.m., I heard something outside. A soft, careful scraping sound along the cabin wall. Like someone dragging their fingers along the wood. I held my breath. It moved slowly, from one side of the cabin, toward the front porch. Then it stopped. A few seconds passed. And then the tapping started again. Tap, tap, tap. Not outside. Inside. I spun around so fast I nearly fell. The tapping was coming from the back corner of the cabin, near the old pantry door I never used because it stuck. I stared at that door, heart pounding. The tapping continued, slower now. Tap, tap, tap. Then the pantry door moved. Not opening. Not closing. Just shaking slightly, like someone was pressing on it from the other side. My brain tried to argue with itself. There's no other side. It's a pantry. It's a dead space. It's... The door rattled harder. I raised the hatchet without thinking. Then something spoke. Not a clear sentence. Not a voice like you'd expect. It sounded like a whisper trying to form words through dry leaves. Home. I backed up, almost tripping over a chair. The whisper came again. You, home! The pantry door stopped shaking. For a moment, everything was still. Then I heard a new sound. A soft clicking. Not tapping. Clicking, like bones. And then, from just inches away on the other side of that stuck pantry door, something slowly dragged downward. It sounded like fingernails carving into wood. A long, slow scratch. And at the end of it, I heard a little tink, tink, like something hard fell onto the floor on the other side. I didn't wait. I ran out the front door barefoot into the cold night, still holding the hatchet. I sprinted to my truck and fumbled the keys so badly I dropped them twice. When the engine finally turned over, my headlights hit the cabin. And I saw it. Hanging from the porch railing was a small wind chime. Freshly made. Still swinging. Bones clicking softly in the air. I drove until sunrise and didn't stop once. I never went back for my things. I called a friend later and told them to contact whoever they needed to. I didn't even explain it properly. I just said there was someone out there. A month later, my friend told me the cabin burned down. The official report said it was an accident. Faulty propane line. Nothing suspicious. But what stuck with me was what he said at the end, almost like an afterthought. They found a metal pole in the woods behind it, he told me. Like a marker. And some weird bone chime thing. I couldn't speak. Then he said, and, Zohaib, there was something carved into a tree right near the cabin. It looked old, but it was fresh enough to see. What did it say? I asked. He hesitated. Then, quietly, it said, "Welcome home." This happened to my cousin, but he told it so many times with the same details that I've never doubted he believed every word of it. He lived off-grid for almost a year in a small trailer he parked on a piece of land he inherited. The place was remote, but not in a mountain adventure way. More like a forgotten pocket of trees behind an old logging road that nobody used anymore. He had solar panels, a generator, and a small garden. He liked being alone. For the first month, he didn't see anyone. Then one evening, while he was outside grilling, he noticed movement through the trees. A light. Not a flashlight beam, but a small warm glow, like a lantern. It moved slowly, weaving between trunks. My cousin watched, half curious and half tense, until it stopped. A silhouette stood there, about 50 yards away, holding the light at chest level. My cousin waved. The figure didn't wave back. They just stood there. After maybe 10 seconds, the light turned and walked back the way it came, disappearing into the trees. My cousin laughed it off. "Just a neighbor checking me out," he said. But from that day forward, he noticed something strange. At night, he could see a cabin in the distance. Not close enough to see details, but close enough to see its outline against the sky. And it never had lights on. Not once. No porch light. No window glow. No flicker of a TV. Nothing. In the daytime, it almost looked abandoned. But at night, he would sometimes see movement around it. Shadows crossing in front. Shapes stepping onto the porch. Always without light. He told himself they were just using candles, or maybe they had a different setup. Still, it felt wrong. Humans like light. We're drawn to it. We build it everywhere we go. These people avoided it. One night, around 11 p.m., he heard someone outside his trailer. Not footsteps exactly, more like careful shifting in the gravel, like a person trying not to crunch it. He held his breath and listened. A gentle knock came on his trailer door. 3 taps. Not aggressive. Not friendly. Just controlled. He didn't answer. He grabbed his phone, but he had no service. The knocking came again. 3 taps. Then a voice spoke through the door. A woman's voice. Soft, calm, like she was trying not to scare him. "Can I borrow your light?" My cousin just stared at the door. The voice continued. "Our light went out. Just for a moment. Can I borrow yours?" My cousin swallowed and finally said, "What light?" There was a pause. Then the woman said, "Your outside light. The one you keep on." My cousin didn't have an outside light. The trailer had a little motion sensor on the side, but it didn't work. He never fixed it. He said, "I don't have one." Silence. Then, a faint sound, like someone exhaling slowly. The woman spoke again, quieter now. "Oh," she said. "Then can I come in and sit with yours?" My cousin said, "No." He expected anger. Or pleading. Instead, the woman said, "That's okay." Then, very gently, "We'll wait here." My cousin felt his stomach tighten. "We?" he asked. No answer. He stepped closer to the door and peered through the small window beside it. All he could see was darkness. Then something moved up close to the glass, blocking what little moonlight there was. A face. Not pressed against it, but close enough that he could make out a shape. The face looked wrong. Like the features were too flat, like it was being seen through wet cloth. Then the face tilted slowly. And the woman's voice whispered, "Please." My cousin backed away. He sat in the corner of the trailer with a kitchen knife, like that was going to do anything, and waited. Minutes passed. Then he heard another sound. A soft scratching. Not at the door. At the side of the trailer. Like fingernails on metal. The scratching moved slowly, around the trailer, circling. Sometimes it stopped. Then it started again. Like something was searching for a weak point. He didn't sleep. Around 4 a.m., the scratching stopped. The air felt different, like the woods were waking up. He finally worked up the courage to look out again. Nothing. No one. No footprints in the dirt. No disturbed gravel. He told himself maybe it was a prank, or some weird drifter. The next day, he decided to confront the situation. He walked toward the neighbor's cabin with his phone and a can of bear spray. When he got close, the place looked even stranger in daylight. The windows were covered from the inside. Not curtains, boards. But not nailed like normal boards. They were placed almost neatly, like someone wanted them removable. There were no signs of a garden, no tools, no chopped wood. The door was closed, but the porch had fresh scuffs on it, like bare feet had been stepping there. My cousin stood at the bottom of the steps and called out, "Hello?" No answer. He climbed the porch slowly and knocked. Nothing. He tried the door handle. It opened. He immediately regretted it. Inside, it smelled like damp fabric and old smoke. The air felt cold, even though it was warm outside. He stepped in and called out again. Then he noticed the walls. There were dozens of mirrors. Not nice mirrors. Old, scratched mirrors in different sizes. They were hung everywhere. Facing each other. Facing corners. Facing the floor. And in the middle of the room was a single chair. On the chair was a lantern. Unlit. My cousin reached toward it, and that's when he heard movement behind him. He spun around. The door was still open. He could see sunlight and trees. But in the doorway, blocking the light, someone stood. A tall person. Too tall. Their head almost touched the top of the frame. They weren't wearing shoes. They weren't wearing much at all, just dark clothing hanging loose. Their face was covered, not by a mask exactly, but by something like a thin, tight cloth wrapped around it. Like it was tied so tight it flattened the shape of the nose and mouth. The figure didn't speak. My cousin tried to back up. And the figure stepped forward. Slow. Quiet. My cousin ran past them, off the porch, and back into the woods, not caring about scratches, not caring about branches. Behind him, he heard a voice, not the woman this time. A man's voice. Low and calm. You shouldn't take light from other people. My cousin didn't stop. He made it back to the trailer and started packing immediately. But while he was shoving clothes into a bag, he noticed something outside through the window. On the dirt near the steps, someone had drawn a circle. And inside the circle, there were dozens of tiny scratches, like someone had dragged bones or teeth through the dirt. And at the top of the circle was a line that looked like a path leading straight toward his trailer. My cousin left that day and never lived off-grid again. Years later, he looked up old property maps and tried to find that cabin again. According to the maps, there was no cabin listed there. No structure. No owner. Just forest. But he still swears that sometimes, when he's driving at night, he'll see a glow far off in the trees. A warm lantern light. And he'll get the sudden, sick feeling that someone is walking toward him, wanting to borrow his light. When people think of off-grid living, they picture wide open land and privacy. But privacy is a funny thing when you're surrounded by miles of woods and you don't really know where your property ends, and someone else's begins. A friend of mine, I'll call him Darren, bought cheap land out in a rural area and built a small cabin with his own hands. He was proud of it. He posted progress photos online. He told everyone he was going to disappear for a while. The nearest neighbor, according to the seller, was an older guy who keeps to himself. Darren liked that. For the first few weeks, Darren never saw him. But one morning, he woke up and noticed something strange. A fence post. A brand new wooden fence post, standing at the edge of his clearing. He hadn't put it there. He walked over, confused, and saw a second post about 10 feet away. Then a third. Someone had started building a fence line across his land. At first, Darren thought maybe he got the property line wrong. Maybe the neighbor was marking it. So Darren did the normal thing. He walked through the woods toward the neighbor's place. The neighbor's cabin was old, smaller than Darren's, and surrounded by junk, rusted equipment, stacked wood, old buckets, broken chairs. It looked lived in, but in a harsh, unfriendly way. Darren approached and called out. After a moment, an older man came out. Gray hair. Sun-weathered face. Eyes that didn't blink enough. Darren explained what he'd seen. The man listened without expression. Then he said, "Fence has to go up." Darren asked, "Why? Are we on the wrong line?" The man stared at him for a long moment, then said, "Keeps things from wandering." Darren laughed a little, trying to keep it friendly. "Wandering from where?" The man didn't answer. He just turned and walked back inside. Darren left feeling annoyed but also unsettled. Over the next week, the fence grew. Every morning, Darren would wake up and see new posts. Then rails. Then wire. And the crazy part was, it wasn't straight. It didn't follow a clean property line. It curved. Almost like it was slowly trying to wrap around Darren's cabin. Darren finally snapped and decided to stop it. He went outside with a tool and started pulling posts. The wood was fresh and strong. Whoever put it in had really hammered it down deep. He got one post out, then another. That night, he heard footsteps outside. Heavy footsteps. He looked out his window and saw the neighbor standing in his clearing. Just standing there, staring at Darren's cabin like it was something he owned. Darren opened the door and yelled, "Hey! Don't come on my land like that!" The neighbor slowly turned his head. Even from that distance, Darren said the man's eyes looked blank. Like he was looking through Darren, not at him. The neighbor lifted one arm and pointed toward the woods. Then he said, "You opened it." Darren's anger faded fast. "Opened what?" The neighbor didn't answer. He just turned and walked back into the trees. The next morning, Darren found the fence posts he'd pulled out, put back in the ground. Perfectly placed. And beside them, laid neatly on the dirt, were Darren's tools. Like someone had borrowed them and returned them with care. Darren took pictures. He marked the posts with paint. He stayed up late watching. For 2 nights, nothing happened. On the 3rd night, he saw movement near the fence line. He grabbed his flashlight and stepped onto the porch. The light cut through the trees and landed on the neighbor. But the neighbor wasn't building the fence. He was standing there, holding something. A sack. A heavy sack that looked like it was filled with rocks. Darren shouted, "What are you doing?" The neighbor lifted the sack, and something inside it shifted with a wet thump. Then the neighbor said quietly, "Back inside." Darren hesitated. Then the neighbor took one slow step forward. And the smell hit Darren. A rotten, sour smell like meat left in the sun. Darren backed up and went inside, locking his door. He watched through a crack in the curtain. The neighbor walked along the fence line and stopped at a spot where the trees were thicker. He set the sack down and opened it. Darren couldn't see what was inside. But he heard it. A soft, weak sound. Like a muffled sob. Darren's skin went cold. He wanted to call the police, but his phone had no service. He wanted to run, but he couldn't leave his place unguarded. He watched as the neighbor reached into the sack and pulled something out, and carried it into the woods. The fence grew faster after that. By the end of the week, it formed a rough circle around Darren's cabin, not tight, but close enough that it felt like being boxed in. Darren decided he was leaving. He loaded his truck with supplies and planned to drive out early in the morning. But that night, he woke up to a sound. A soft clinking. Like wire vibrating. He looked out the window. The fence gate, something he didn't even remember seeing installed, was swinging gently. Back and forth. Back and forth. And standing beside it was the neighbor, holding the lantern from Darren's porch. Darren hadn't left it outside. The neighbor looked up at Darren's window and said, almost kindly, "Now you're safe." Darren didn't know what to do. He didn't go outside. He stayed frozen until sunrise. In the morning, the fence gate was closed. And on Darren's porch, placed neatly in the center like an offering, was a coil of wire. Twisted into a word. It took Darren a second to read it. Because it wasn't written normally. It was crooked and uneven. But the word was clear. Stay. Darren left anyway. He drove straight to town and reported what he'd seen. The police took notes, but without evidence, they didn't take it seriously. A deputy did go out to check the properties. Later, he called Darren and told him something that made Darren feel sick. "There's no fence," the deputy said. Darren argued. "It's right around the cabin. You can't miss it." The deputy's voice stayed flat. "Sir, there isn't a fence. There are a few old posts rotting in the ground, but nothing new." Darren's mouth went dry. "What about the neighbor?" Silence. Then the deputy said, "There's no one living in that cabin. It's been empty for years." Darren still has the photos on his phone. But when he shows them, they don't look like fences. They look like thin lines in darkness, like something that doesn't want to be captured clearly. And to this day, Darren swears that sometimes, when he wakes up suddenly at night, he can hear wire clinking softly in the air. Like something is still trying to build a fence around him. This last story is the one that messed with me the most because it's the kind of thing that could happen to anybody. A couple, newly married, bought a small off-grid cabin as a weekend escape. The cabin sat near a lake, surrounded by thick trees. No neighbors in sight, but they were told there was an off-grid community a few miles away, people living quietly, mostly keeping to themselves. The first weekend was perfect. The second weekend, they noticed something odd. Around sunset, they heard a bell. Not a big church bell. More like a small metal bell being rung slowly. Ding, ding, ding. It came from deep in the woods, not from the lake. They went outside and listened. Then they saw figures moving between the trees. 3 people. Maybe 4. They walked in a line, like they knew exactly where they were going. None of them carried flashlights. They disappeared behind a slope near the tree line. The couple, curious but cautious, watched from their porch. A few minutes later, the bell rang again, farther away, and the figures returned the same way they came, back into the woods. The next day, the husband joked, "They're doing some weird forest church thing." They laughed. But that night, at the same time, the bell rang again. And again, figures walked through the trees. Same line. Same pace. Same spot. By the 4th weekend, the couple wasn't laughing anymore. Because they noticed something else. On their own property, near the back where the trees began, little things started showing up. First, a small bundle of twigs tied with string. Then a pile of smooth lake stones stacked neatly. Then, this was the worst, a small animal skull placed on a flat rock like it was meant to be seen. They told themselves it was just nature. Just someone messing around. But the bell kept ringing every weekend. And every weekend the figures walked. One night the wife whispered, "What if they're feeding something?" The husband didn't answer, but his face said he'd thought the same thing. So the next weekend, they decided to follow. They waited until the bell rang. They stayed in the shadows, quiet, moving slowly behind trees. The figures didn't look back. They walked as if they didn't care who might see them. They reached the slope and moved down into a small dip in the land, like a natural bowl hidden by trees. The couple crouched at the edge and looked down. In the center of the bowl was a large stump, or what used to be one. It had been carved into. Not cleanly. Not like art. Like someone had hacked into it over and over until it formed a crude, hollowed-out basin. and inside the basin was food. Raw meat. Fresh. The smell hit the couple even from where they were hiding. One of the figures stepped forward and rang the bell once. Ding. Then they all backed away, standing at the edge of the bowl like they were waiting for something to arrive. The husband held his wife's hand so tight it hurt. Minutes passed. Then something moved on the far side of the bowl. At first, it looked like a deer. But the way it moved wasn't right. It didn't step like a normal animal. It dragged itself forward, like it was pulling weight behind it. Its head was low, shoulders rolling strangely. Then it lifted its head. And the couple realized it wasn't a deer. It was pale. Too pale. Its skin looked stretched and hairless, shining slightly in the moonlight. Its eyes reflected light like an animal's, but they were set too forward, too human. It crawled up to the stump and began to eat. Not politely. Not carefully. It tore into the meat with a sound like wet cloth ripping. One of the figures, an older woman by the shape of her, whispered something the couple couldn't hear. And the creature paused, as if listening. Then it turned its head slightly, toward where the couple were hiding. The husband's blood ran cold. It sniffed the air. Slowly. Then it made a sound that didn't belong to any animal the couple knew. It sounded like a person trying to whistle through broken teeth. The older woman rang the bell sharply, twice. Ding ding. The creature snapped back to the stump and kept eating. The figures didn't move, but the couple felt it, felt the fear roll through their bodies like nausea. They backed away as quietly as they could, moving up the slope, trying not to break sticks. They made it halfway back when the wife stepped on something hard. It crunched. A bone. The sound was small, but in that kind of silence, it might as well have been a scream. The bells stopped ringing behind them. They froze. Then came footsteps. Not from the figures. From the woods. Fast. Heavy. Too many. The husband grabbed his wife's hand and ran. Behind them, branches snapped and something crashed through the brush, gaining. They didn't look back. They burst into their clearing, sprinted to the cabin, slammed the door, and locked it. The husband shook as he shoved a chair under the knob, like that would help. They stood there in the dark, listening. For a moment it was quiet. Then the bell rang again. But this time, it was close. Very close. Right outside the cabin. Ding, ding, ding. The wife covered her mouth to keep from crying out. The bell stopped. And then came a soft knock. 3 taps. The husband and wife stared at the door. A voice spoke. A woman's voice. Calm, almost friendly. You saw, she said. The husband didn't respond. The woman continued. It's okay. Most people don't see. But you did. Silence. Then she said, Now you have to help. The husband shouted. Go away. The woman sighed. Then softly, We can't. And then the scratching started. Not on the door. On the window. A slow scrape like something sharp dragging across glass. The wife turned her head just enough to look. And she saw a face outside the window. Not the woman's. Something pale, pressed close, eyes reflecting. And as it stared in, the bell rang once more, right beside it. Ding. The creature's mouth opened slightly. And it smiled. Not like a dog baring teeth. Like a person smiling when they recognize you. The couple stayed inside until sunrise. When morning came, the woods looked normal again. Birds chirped. The lake shimmered. The fear felt impossible, like a bad dream. But outside their front door was something that proved it happened. A bundle, wrapped neatly in cloth. The husband didn't want to open it. But he did. Inside was raw meat. Fresh. Still warm. And on top of it was a small note, written in shaky, careful handwriting. For tonight. They sold the cabin a month later at a huge loss. They never told the full story to the buyers. But the wife said something once later that still gives me chills. She said, "I don't think they were threatening us." "What do you mean?" I asked. And she said, "I think they were inviting us." Then she went quiet and added, almost like she was remembering something she didn't want to. "And sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear a bell. Far away. Like it's calling something to eat." Which story scared you the most? Comment below and subscribe for more true horror stories. If you want to send your story to us for narration, do share at belladarktales@gmail.com.